Have you ever wondered how your auto mechanic can diagnose your car problems with nothing more than your description of the weird noise that your engine is making? The reason they're able to do this is because they can analyze what are, to you and me, really arbitrary and random sense details. They can do this because they have lots of experience dealing with engines and the types of problems that they have, and the noises these components make when they stop working appropriately. Analysis is the level of cognitive engagement that is required to make a diagnosis. It happens in medicine, happens in psychiatry, it happens when a teacher evaluates or assesses an essay written by a student, being able to recognize where the problem began and then how to correct it. It's a very deep level of cognitive engagement, and it's built on all of the previous levels of Bloom's taxonomy that came before it. So I think it might be helpful to think of these different levels of cognitive engagement, or these different learning objectives on Bloom's taxonomy, as the elements of building a house. So the simplest level, the knowledge level or the memory level, we might think of as the building materials. You need to understand what a brick is and why it's useful, or rather, what a brick is and how it might be used in a wall. You need to understand what mortar is and that it can hold bricks together. But this is simply knowledge. It's just information. How those things fit together, so bricks and mortar fitting together, vapor barriers, how a wall is constructed, how a foundation is built, why there's a specific order to building a wall, and how walls can support rafters, and how rafters can support a roof, and so on. That's the next level. That's the level of understanding. And then the third level is application, going from information, knowledge, and understanding enough to make explanations to building an actual wall, building a foundation, leveling the land, constructing a wall, putting a roof on. That's the application component. And so if we follow those steps in a predictable way, we're following the rules of architecture and carpentry, we can build a house. And usually we can do so if we follow a blueprint. But notice we're not changing any of those rules. We're not interpreting them in any widely divergent way. That would come much later in the list of cognitive operations, or order of cognitive operations. The fourth level is analysis. And so knowledge, understanding, application, we can use that to build a house. With analysis, imagine the house has already been built, so we're coming at it from the opposite direction. Can you look at a house, and by looking at how the bricks were put together and where other raw materials were used and where the vapor barrier is and how the foundation was laid, can you predict or explain how it came about? Not understanding why there are certain properties of brick and why they're useful and so on, but to be able to look at a house and say, all right, here's what the builders did. They must have started with this, they must have made sure they did this and checked that, and on and on and on. This is analysis. So notice, with analysis, we're no longer looking at building blocks to something. We're looking at the individual parts that lead to a whole. With analysis, we're looking at the whole and then breaking it down into its individual parts. That is what analyze means. As we get into the later years of a student's education, we start to see more learning objectives that ask students to analyze information, analyze experiences, analyze experiments, and so on. So they're breaking whole units down into their component parts because they understand it so well that they can recognize which factors are most important. This is the analytic procedure. And there are two areas of Albany State University's general education program that ask students to practice this skill. They are Area C, which is arts and humanities. It includes courses like literature, art history, music, and so on. And the other area is social sciences. So this has psychology, sociology, criminal justice, anthropology, and I think behavioral economics. There are a few more that are in there as well. So what does analyze mean? So a couple of synonyms for analyze are break down into relevant basic parts, differentiate, or organize. And remember, these are actions. Students must be participating in this process. It doesn't matter how brilliant a professor's analytic skills are, or skills at categorization, and giving descriptions, and so on. If the professor is the one coming up with all of the analyses, or showing repeatedly to students how to perform these analyses, then the students are not practicing these skills themselves. They need to be engaged in the process. So what are some of activities that can be used in the classroom or for homework or during assessments that would ask students to analyze? So there are 3. Differentiating, which is sifting through lots of information for the relevant bits. That would be like coming to a house and seeing all the different components that go into it, recognizing that some of them are superficial, they're unnecessary, so where the lights hang, what sort of like the paint color that's used, things that add to the aesthetic appeal that don't really predict the structural integrity of the house. So being able to separate those apart, but recognizing that even though some roof shingles might look better than other roof shingles, the ones that look better may actually be better. They may perform better. And so if you understand that, you can actually look at it and say, okay, I understand something that a decision that the builder made with a selection of these shingles. Organizing is another example of this. In psychiatry or in psychopathology, when you're looking at a patient who comes in or a client who comes in and they start listing some of their personal problems, and as a psychologist you're thinking which of these symptoms fit together and which ones may be common enough to not be considered abnormal or pathological. So you're sifting through, all right, so what is normal malaise and what is potentially pathological here that would require a psychiatric diagnosis. That process right there is the organization process. And some of that has to do with differentiating. So you notice that these two connect with each other, differentiating what is pathological and what is normal, and then being able to put those into categories and group them together. Okay, those sound like depression, but that one right there sounds like anxiety. Do those happen together? Is it a comorbid problem, or are they two distinct disorders that just happen to be occurring together? And then finally, attributing. This is reading between the lines. You may have had this experience with your auto mechanic. You explain, okay, whenever I am starting from a stoplight, there's a grinding and sort of hesitation that my car does, and then nothing else happens. And then the mechanic will ask you follow-up questions. Does it happen when you're slowing down too? Does it ever happen when you're shifting from neutral into drive? What they're trying to do is assess whether or not it's a transmission problem or a drivetrain problem, possibly a rear end problem. And they can ask those follow-up questions because they're reading between the lines. They're wondering if there's important information that you haven't shared, but if you did share, they'd be able to solve the problem a little bit more easily. You don't know what information is relevant or not. You can only answer the questions that the auto mechanic has. If your mechanic is capable of analysis, and usually they are, if they've been dealing with it for a long time and they have lots of experience, they're going to be listening for the whole musical score, even though you're giving them bits. And so they're going to say, all right, is this part of it too? Nope, okay, then it's a different score. What about this? And they might even say, I don't believe you, because the only way these fit together, right, they're reading between the lines, is if this happens too. If it doesn't, then you're lying about one of the other components. The problem you're describing is impossible, and that happens too. So they have to take the car for a spin and see which of those problems that they experience. What might this look like in a class? Well, I mentioned earlier that we use the analysis learning objective in our Area C, which is Arts and Humanities. So one of those courses is art. So here students will critically analyze forms of artistic expression that reflect values from a cultural or an informed personal perspective. Well, let's take a look at this painting. And this was painted by my late neighbor. So he recently passed away, but he was a local artist and had exhibits. This is one of his pieces that I found online. How might we analyze it? Well, if we stay at the level of knowledge, if you're familiar with Steve Hinton's paintings, you might say, oh yeah, that's a Hinton. And so you're able to say a fact about it. You might even be able to understand something about the kind of painting that he does and then predict a little bit about what the painting might mean. You might be able to put his painting style into practice once you understand some of the components of his artwork. For analysis, again, we're coming at this from the opposite direction. Can we look at this painting and describe or anticipate or predict how it was done? Why it was done? Why might he have done this? Why might he have painted it in this way? Notice, we're not putting together what we already know about him. We're looking at this painting and going backwards. What might this painting say about its painter? What might this painting say about the time in which it was painted, or the topic that was trying to be portrayed through this painting? Some simple analytic questions might be, how did the artist, or how did Steve give a sense of 3 dimensions when painting this? And so you have to know a little bit about how to paint in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional canvas. Things about shading and superposition and shape and size and clarity. And so drawing on each of those components of the painting process. You might ask him about how colors were created. What about the demographics that are portrayed here? What does this say about social class in the American South? What does this say about history or politics? Notice, we're not giving any of the answers to the student. We're giving them contexts within which students can draw analyses or make analyses. They can give explanations without being given the components of those explanations. So how might we analyze novels or music, videos, religious documents, sculptures? How do you teach a student to perform these analyses? Well, how would you teach an auto mechanic how to diagnose an engine problem with nothing but sound? Well, first, they would need to know the kinds of components that exist on cars. They would need to know how those components often break down. It would help to know which breakdowns are the most probable, how those components fit together, what it sounds like when those components no longer function correctly, what it sounds like when they do function correctly, what those components are doing when they're functioning. So like gears that fit together, and so grinding is usually a gearing issue. If something sounds like it's scraping, well, what components move in a way that would lead to scraping if something broke down? What components of a car make it go forward, make it stop? And what does it feel like when those components start to wear down or break down? You have to go through each of those components and practice and experience them and see and feel and notice and be aware. You have to do that over and over and over again. So you can imagine a mechanic who's only turned a few bolts won't know anything except for the facts about being an auto mechanic if they've read manuals and taken an exam possibly. But one who has repaired hundreds of engines will be able to listen to and recognize problems much more easily. So what about analyzing a novel? Well, you would have to predict that students have done a lot of reading. They understand maybe something not about the author that they're reading, but how novels can be broken down, how novels can be used to exhibit a time period or a political perspective or a potential problem or a philosophical conundrum. As an instructor, you're in a position to dictate what it is the students analyze. But again, the goal there is to get them to do the organization, to do the breaking down into its most relevant components and predicting why and how they fit together. In psychology, so that was one of the other areas, social sciences. In psychology, my behavior right here will tell you something about my personality. Now, you need to understand the different parts of personality in order to do an analysis like that. Or if you understand a Freudian approach to personality, there are certain aspects of my personality that are being exhibited right now, and you might even be able to predict what aspects are being hidden by some of my peculiar behaviors that I'm showing or demonstrating right now. So you can perform a psychoanalysis or a Jungian personality analysis on me if you know what those are, so you have knowledge about them, you understand why those components, those behavioral components, predict things that occurred in my childhood. You've maybe even performed a personality analysis yourself. Maybe you took a personality inventory and then interpreted its results. And now you're looking at a clip of human behavior, and you're able to analyze, all right, so what components of this tell me something about Patrick's personality? What components are irrelevant? You're able to break that down, and then with the ones that are relevant, what do those things tell you? The more experience you have doing that, the easier it will be. So in your classroom, what examples, what domains of your discipline will be useful for students to practice this skill? What will they be interested in enough to have some buy-in? So hopefully it will appeal to them, it will apply to their lives. And what will it look like when they do it well? What will it look like when they don't yet understand it? And what can help push them in that direction? As with all learning objectives, it's possible to give an example of analysis, ask students to memorize it, and then on an exam or assessment, have them repeat it. So while what they're doing could be called analysis, the actual cognitive skill they're using is memory. And so you have to make sure with your assessments and with the activities that really challenge them, you're introducing new examples, new opportunities, new paintings, or new domains of your discipline for them to put that into practice. It would be unfair to take a clip of one of my videos and ask a student to analyze it in terms of personality. What does this video tell you about the relationship that I had with my parents, for example, if you haven't talked about the relationship between behavior and childhood experiences? So that needs to be one of the earlier components. And so, but again, that's all information. We haven't yet had the opportunity to take a novel example, take some raw data, and interpret it. So imagine that you're teaching a general education course in Area E, which is a social science, or Area C, which are the arts and humanities, and you have this one objective that students will be able to analyze musical scores, paintings, human behavior, but you only have 1 hour to do it. What topic will you choose? What example will you give? What background information do students have to have? And what will you ask them to do? How will you know once they have begun to master it? 1 hour, that's not a lot of time. That means you can cut out all of the information that they're otherwise exposed to. You're just picking those bits that you think will be most relevant to them and asking them to spend their time doing what's most challenging, but giving them enough background so that they're prepared to do it. 1 hour. Now expand that to the entire semester, 45 hours. Don't think you have to add everything back in. Now add a couple more, maybe leading up examples that are a little easier, so that when they get to the end, they're able to do something much more complicated than they could when the semester first started.